George Mason was a passionate anti-federalist who spoke against ratification of the Constitution on June 4, 1778, in Virginia. He was also present at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, where they actually made the document. Mason refused to sign the Constitution because he believed it would not adequately represent the people, and because it would tax them unfairly. He thought that the states should have the power to tax instead of the federal government, so that they could lay taxes that were appropriate to each region and sect of people. He also thought that the people would not be well represented in this new federal government. He thought the representation would have been more effective if it were done on a state level. The new federal government also seemed too powerful to him, and he believed that it would eventually overtake and obliterate the state governments. George Mason himself was born on December 11, 1725, and died October 7, 1792. He was a prosperous man and lived in Gunston Hall, a 5,500-acre plantation that is still preserved today. The plantation came stocked with slaves, who Mason owned proudly. His father actually died when he was 10, so Mason was raised and heavily influenced by his uncle, John Mercer. Other than a politician, George Mason was a planter and an investor. In his speech to the Virginia Ratifying Convention, George Mason labeled the new federal government as a dangerous power that was set to overtake the current state governments. He believed that the enactment of the Constitution would change the entire face of America. Instead of just being some simple confederacy, it would be a nation run under this powerful and, frankly, way too extensive government. He believed that the Constitutional Convention, even though he had been in attendance himself, had way overstepped its boundaries. Instead of simply altering the Articles of Confederation, it had created an entirely new system of government. This new federal government would be too powerful and would eventually consume all of the powers of the state governments. The power is calculated to annihilate totally the state governments. Will the people of this great community submit to be individually taxed by two different and distinct powers? Will they suffer themselves to be doubly harassed? These two concurrent powers cannot exist long together. The one will destroy the other. The general government being paramount to, and in every respect, more powerful than the state governments, the latter must give way to the former. Mason claimed to be trying to protect the people from the double power of two full governments. Alongside him were fellow anti-federalists such as Patrick Henry, who was a passionate speaker at the Ratifying Convention, and James Monroe, who would later become president and write the Monroe Doctrine. 600 Massachusetts farmers had actually found themselves being harassed by the government in 1787 during Shays' Rebellion. None of their representatives had been willing to help them through their debts, so they decided to revolt. Mason was concerned that the new government would not prevent uprisings like these from happening again. George Mason also voiced his concerns with the system of taxation that had been set up by the Constitution. He was worried that if the federal government enacted general taxes for the whole nation to pay, that they would affect different regions with different weights. Is it not well known that what would be a proper tax in one state would be grievous in another? 65 members cannot possibly know the situation and circumstances of all the inhabitants of the immersed continent. When a certain sum comes to be taxed, and the mode of levying to be fixed, they will lay the tax on the article which will be most productive and easiest in the collection, without consulting the real circumstances or convenience of a country, with which, in fact, they cannot be sufficiently acquainted. Mason is concerned that any tax levied by the national government will not adequately cater to the needs of the individual states. This foreshadows the Whiskey Rebellion. The whiskey tax was passed by the federal government in 1791. For most regions of the United States, this excise tax was reasonable, but for the farmers of southwestern Pennsylvania, who primarily sold distilled whiskey for a living, the 7 cents per gallon tariff on whiskey that was typically 25 to 30 cents per gallon was detrimental. Part of the tax was meant to help fight off the Indians on the western frontier, but the southern Pennsylvanian farmers could not understand this benefit and saw only the money the government was stealing from their hard-earned profits. These farmers traditionally had an independent mindset and attempted succession before. Actually, in 1776, they declared themselves the 14th state of Westsylvania. Yeah, good luck with that one. And so they decided to give a valid reason for breaking off. Proved dangerous. The Whiskey Rebellion is the quintessence of what Mason was afraid of. That the government would not be able to foresee how some tax would affect regions differently, and that they would end up angering one region in particular. If the people were more adequately represented in their governments, this may not have been an issue. George Mason suggested that the power of the taxes be given to the state governments, where the legislators knew their people better. If we give the general government the power of demanding the quotas of the states, with an alternative of laying direct taxes in case of non-compliance, then the mischief would be avoided, and the certainty of this conditional power would, in all human probability, prevent the application, and the sums necessary for the union would then be laid by the states, by those who know how it can be best raised, and by those who have a fellow feeling for us. A state legislature would have examined its population and realized that a whiskey tax of such volume would serve detrimental to its people, and would have chosen something else to tax its people on. George Mason found the Constitution's method of representing the people inadequate. Because the nation had recently grown so large with the adoption of the Northwest Territory through the Northwest Ordinance, it was even more difficult for one federal government to represent all of its people. The Louisiana Purchase would also be coming soon, in 1803, which would provide the United States with even more land and people to represent. George Mason felt that a small mass of men in the federal government was not physically able to represent all of the people of the many different regions of the United States. We are then under the necessity of having this very inadequate representation. To make representation real and actual, the number of representatives ought to be adequate. They ought to mix with the people, think as they think, feel as they feel, and ought to be perfectly amendable to them, and thoroughly acquainted through their interest and condition. Mason believed that in order for a legislator to make decisions beneficial to their people, they must actually know the people they are representing. This means understanding their lifestyles, how they earn their paychecks, and what morals and values are most important to them. He wrote in the Virginia Declaration of Rights that legislators were meant to be representatives of the people. People, of course, meaning all free white men with a common interest in the nation. His dissatisfaction with the quality of representation in America began early, though, when he believed that the public should have been more involved in the creation of the Constitution. Evidently, a small group of white men shut away in a small building for a couple of months, drafting some elaborate and complicated plan to rule almost 4 million people, didn't quite satisfy him.